The moment I heard the machines, I knew 200 years of history were about to disappear. The sound reached me before the sight did. A deep mechanical rumble rolled across the valley just after sunrise, echoing off the water that flowed through the narrow creek behind my property. I dropped the old ledger I had been reviewing and stepped onto the porch. Cold morning air carried the smell of wet earth and freshly cut grass, but beneath it was something else. Diesel. Heavy equipment. My stomach tightened immediately. My name is Nathan Whitmore, and for most of my life, the old mill sitting beside that creek had been more than a building. It was a piece of my family, a piece of local history, a piece of America that somehow survived wars, floods, economic crashes, and 2 centuries of change. The mill had stood there since the early 1800s, long before the neighborhood existed, long before the HOA existed, long before anyone currently living in the area was born. I jumped into my truck and drove down the gravel road toward the creek. As I rounded the final bend, the sight waiting for me felt unreal. Large construction equipment surrounded the old structure. Workers moved around the property while pieces of weathered timber lay scattered across the ground. The giant wooden water wheel that had turned beside the creek for generations was already partially dismantled. For a moment, I simply sat there gripping the steering wheel. The morning sun reflected off the water while dust drifted through the air where the mill had stood. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed a familiar vehicle parked nearby. Deborah Langford's SUV. HOA president. The woman who had spent the last year trying to convince everyone that the mill was nothing more than an eyesore. An obstacle. A liability. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the site. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. The old stone foundation was still visible beneath the dust. The same foundation my grandfather showed me when I was 8 years old. The same foundation that appeared in photographs dating back over a century. I could still remember standing inside the mill as a child, listening to stories about the farmers who once brought grain there by wagon. The smell of old wood. The creak of the beams. The sound of water moving beneath the structure. Now all of it was being reduced to debris. What made the situation even worse was that this was not a surprise. Deborah had been targeting the mill for months. Violation notices, community complaints, special assessments. Every meeting seemed to include another discussion about removing it. According to her, the structure hurt property values. According to her, maintaining it was unnecessary. According to me, she never understood what she was looking at. As I stared at the destruction unfolding in front of me, one thought kept repeating in my head. Deborah believed this was the end of the story. She believed the mill would disappear and the problem would disappear with it. What she did not know was that several months earlier, I had mailed a thick application package containing photographs, surveys, historical records, and preservation documents to a federal review office hundreds of miles away. And somewhere at that exact moment, people were reviewing the file that could change everything. Most people who looked at the mill saw an old building beside a creek. I saw a timeline carved into wood and stone. The morning after the demolition, I returned to the site before sunrise. A layer of fog hovered above the water while the first light of day reflected off the remaining foundation stones. The air smelled different now. For decades, the scent of aged timber and flowing water had defined that corner of the property. Now the dominant smell was fresh dirt and broken wood. I stood there in silence, staring at what remained. 2 centuries of history reduced to scattered fragments. Yet even as the loss settled in, my mind kept drifting backward through time. The mill had been part of my family for generations. My grandfather used to bring me there every summer. He carried a ring of old brass keys and treated the place like a cathedral. I still remembered the sound of those keys jingling as he unlocked the heavy wooden door. Inside, sunlight streamed through narrow windows and illuminated dust particles floating through the air. Massive wooden gears stood beside stone walls worn smooth by time. Every beam seemed to hold a story. Every mark in the wood represented another year the structure had survived. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather showed me a faded photograph taken in the 1800s. Farmers stood beside wagons loaded with grain. Children posed near the water wheel. The mill towered behind them exactly where it stood today. That photograph changed the way I looked at the building. It stopped being property and became history. Years later, after inheriting the land, I spent countless weekends researching the mill's origins. I visited county archives. I studied historical maps. I collected newspaper articles, survey records, and family journals. What started as curiosity eventually became something larger. Piece by piece, I discovered that the mill was one of the oldest surviving structures in the region. It had supplied local farms for generations and played a role in the early development of the entire county. Some of the records I found were nearly 200 years old. Others contained handwritten notes from people who helped operate the mill long before electricity reached the valley. Those discoveries eventually led me to a difficult realization. If nobody formally documented its significance, the mill's history could disappear. That was why I began assembling preservation records months before the conflict with the HOA reached its peak. Every photograph, every deed, every survey, every historical reference. I organized everything carefully. At the time, I never imagined I would need those records because the structure itself would be gone. Looking across the creek that morning, I noticed sunlight beginning to touch the remaining stone foundation. The water still flowed exactly as it had for generations. Birds still moved through the trees lining the bank. Nature seemed completely indifferent to what had happened. But history was different. History depended on people remembering. And as I looked at the empty space where the mill once stood, I made a quiet promise to myself. If the building could no longer tell its story, then I would. The conflict did not begin with demolition equipment. It began with paperwork. Looking back, that was the part most people never understood. Deborah did not wake up one morning and decide to remove the mill. She built toward it step by step, one meeting, one complaint, and one letter at a time. The first notice arrived nearly a year before the structure disappeared. I found it in my mailbox on a warm spring afternoon while the creek flowed steadily beside the property and sunlight reflected off the weathered boards of the old mill. The letter claimed that the structure negatively affected the visual standards of the community. I remember reading it twice because I genuinely thought it had been sent by mistake. The mill sat on private land. It predated every home in the neighborhood by nearly 2 centuries. More importantly, it was maintained. The roof had been stabilized. The stonework had been preserved. The surrounding grounds were kept clean. There was nothing neglected about it. I responded politely and included photographs, property records, and maintenance documentation. Weeks later, another letter arrived. This time the concern involved safety. According to the notice, aging structures could create liability issues. Again, I supplied reports, inspection records, and engineering assessments. Again, the issue should have ended there. Instead, it grew. Throughout the summer, HOA meetings became increasingly focused on the mill. Deborah rarely mentioned it directly at first. She preferred phrases like community appearance, modernization, and property value protection. Yet everyone knew what she meant. Whenever discussion turned toward older structures, heads would slowly turn toward me. The strange part was that many residents actually liked the mill. Families stopped to photograph it. Local artists painted it. History enthusiasts occasionally visited to learn about its origins. Several longtime homeowners privately told me it was one of the most recognizable landmarks in the area. None of that seemed to matter to Deborah. To her, the mill represented something that did not fit her vision of the community. One evening, I attended an HOA meeting held inside the clubhouse overlooking the neighborhood lake. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint, while residents filled nearly every seat. Deborah stood at the front with presentation slides projected onto a large screen. For the first time, the mill appeared openly in the presentation. Photographs filled the screen. Close-up images of weathered wood. Detailed shots of aging beams. Carefully selected angles designed to emphasize age rather than significance. The presentation lasted nearly 20 minutes. By the end, Deborah had transformed a historic landmark into what sounded like a maintenance problem. I sat quietly and listened. Arguing emotionally would accomplish nothing. Facts mattered more. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to express support. Others admitted they had never realized how old the structure actually was. That conversation stayed with me during the drive home. Because while Deborah was building a case against the mill, something unexpected was happening. More people were becoming interested in its history. More questions were being asked. More records were being uncovered. Standing beside the creek later that night, listening to water move beneath the old water wheel, I remember running my hand across one of the original wooden beams. The surface felt rough beneath my fingers. 200 years of weather, seasons, and history stood beneath that roof. At the time, I thought the biggest challenge would be convincing people of its value. I had no idea Deborah was already planning something much bigger. The turning point arrived during the fall. While Deborah continued focusing on HOA meetings and enforcement notices, I was spending my weekends somewhere entirely different. Most Saturdays began before sunrise with a thermos of coffee, a stack of folders, and long drives to county archives, historical societies, and state record offices. The deeper I looked into the mill's history, the more remarkable the story became. What I originally believed was a well-preserved local landmark turned out to be something far more significant. Old survey maps showed the mill appearing on documents dating back to the earliest years of county settlement. Property records connected it to several founding families who helped establish trade routes throughout the region. Newspaper articles from the late 19th century described community gatherings held beside the creek during harvest seasons. One fragile document I discovered inside a state archive referenced the mill's role during a period of regional economic hardship when local farmers depended on it to process grain. Every new record felt like uncovering another piece of a forgotten puzzle. The smell of old paper and aging books became familiar companions during those months. I photographed everything, scanned everything, cataloged everything. Back at home, I converted an entire room into a research space. Boxes filled with copies of deeds, maps, photographs, engineering drawings, and historical reports slowly covered every available surface. Friends joked that I was turning into a full-time historian. The truth was that I had become obsessed with making sure the mill's story survived regardless of what happened next. Meanwhile, the pressure from Deborah continued building. Additional notices arrived questioning maintenance costs, visual appearance, and future land use. Some letters hinted that removing the structure might ultimately benefit the neighborhood. Others suggested that modernization would improve property values. I responded professionally to every communication, but by then my focus had shifted. Deborah was fighting a battle over appearance. I was building a record of historical significance. One chilly afternoon, I attended a meeting with a preservation consultant recommended by a local historical society. We spent nearly 4 hours reviewing photographs, construction details, ownership records, and survey data. The consultant studied several images in silence before finally looking up from the table. According to her preliminary assessment, the mill possessed characteristics that could qualify it for federal historical review consideration. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Hearing those words felt surreal. I had always believed the mill mattered. Now someone with professional expertise was confirming it. That evening, I returned to the creek just before sunset. Orange light reflected across the water while leaves drifted slowly along the current. The old water wheel creaked softly in the distance. Standing there, I realized the situation had become larger than a dispute with an HOA, larger than neighborhood politics, larger than Deborah. The mill represented a physical connection to people whose names most residents had forgotten. Losing that connection would erase something that could never truly be replaced. Over the following weeks, the federal heritage application grew thicker and thicker. Photographs, historical narratives, engineering assessments, preservation recommendations. By the time I finally sealed the package and prepared it for submission, it contained hundreds of pages. As I watched the clerk carry the application away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The process could take months. There were no guarantees. But one thing was certain. Long before the demolition equipment ever appeared beside the creek, the paperwork that would eventually change everything was already moving through the system. Winter settled over the valley as the conflict reached its most dangerous stage. The trees surrounding the creek stood bare against gray skies, and thin sheets of ice occasionally formed along the edges of the water during the coldest mornings. From a distance, everything appeared peaceful. The old mill remained standing beside the creek exactly where it had stood for generations. Yet beneath that calm surface, pressure was building faster than ever. Deborah had stopped talking about maintenance concerns. She had stopped talking about appearance standards. The conversation now revolved around money. According to the newest HOA proposals, special assessments and compliance fees could be applied to properties considered inconsistent with future community development plans. The language sounded technical, professional, reasonable, but everyone understood what it meant. The mill had become a target. During one HOA meeting, Deborah stood before a packed room, and presented what she described as a long-term vision for the neighborhood. Charts filled the screen behind her. Proposed improvements, future projects, expanded amenities. Then a rendering appeared showing the area surrounding the creek. The mill was gone. In its place stood landscaped walking paths, decorative lighting, and a small recreation area. A few residents applauded. Others looked confused. I sat quietly near the back of the room, studying the image. Deborah spoke as though the mill's removal was already inevitable. The strange thing was that she never once mentioned its history. Not its age, not its significance, not the research that had already been completed. To her, the structure existed only as an obstacle standing in the way of a development plan. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached me. Some expressed concern. Others apologized for the direction the discussion had taken. One elderly resident told me she remembered visiting the mill as a child with her father. Another shared photographs her family had taken there decades earlier. Those conversations reinforced something I had begun noticing for months. The more Deborah pushed against the mill, the more people became curious about it. Unfortunately, curiosity moves slower than bureaucracy. The following week brought another certified letter. Then another. The language became increasingly aggressive. Deadlines appeared. Financial penalties were discussed. References to legal action surfaced for the first time. Every document joined the growing file cabinet in my office where I stored copies of everything related to the dispute. One evening, as snow flurries drifted across the property outside my window, I reviewed the entire timeline from beginning to end. Inspection requests, meeting minutes, violation notices, assessment proposals. Every page told the same story. Deborah was escalating. What she did not know was that I had already informed multiple preservation organizations about the mill and provided them with copies of my federal application package. Several historians had begun reviewing the material independently. The process moved slowly, but it was moving. Standing outside beside the creek later that night, I listened to water flowing beneath the old water wheel. The moon reflected across the surface while cold air carried the scent of pine through the valley. The mill looked beautiful beneath the winter sky. Timeless. Permanent. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Deborah had invested too much time and too much political capital to stop now. She wanted a final victory. She wanted the mill gone. And somewhere deep inside, I knew she was preparing to make the biggest mistake of her entire campaign. The day everything changed began with a phone call I almost ignored. I was attending a preservation workshop nearly 2 hours away when my phone started vibrating repeatedly on the conference table. At first, I silenced it. Then it rang again and again. By the fourth call, I stepped into the hallway and answered. The voice on the other end belonged to a neighbor. His words came fast and uneven. Heavy equipment had arrived at the property. Workers were gathering near the creek. The mill was surrounded. For a second, I thought there had to be some mistake. Then I heard the concern in his voice and knew there was not. I left immediately. The drive back felt endless. Winter clouds hung low across the valley while traffic crawled along the highway. Every minute felt longer than the last. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was another inspection. Maybe it was some type of survey. Maybe someone had finally realized the significance of the structure and wanted to document it. Deep down, however, I already knew the truth. Deborah had been escalating for months. She wanted a final outcome. By the time I reached the property, the outcome was already unfolding. The sound hit first. Engines. Machinery. The crack of old timber separating after centuries of bearing weight. I pulled onto the gravel road and stopped. Dust drifted through the cold air beside the creek. Workers moved around the site while construction vehicles occupied the area where families had taken photographs for generations. The old water wheel was partially dismantled. Sections of the exterior wall had already been removed. I stepped out of the truck and simply stared. The mill had survived floods that reshaped the creek. It had survived storms that tore through the valley. It had survived economic collapses, ownership changes, and nearly 200 years of weather. Yet now it was disappearing in a single morning. Several residents stood nearby watching. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared shocked. One elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes as she stared at the structure. A local photographer who had documented the mill for years stood silently, holding his camera without taking a single picture. Even people who never fully appreciated its history seemed disturbed by what they were witnessing. Then I noticed Deborah. She stood near the edge of the site speaking with contractors and several HOA representatives. Her posture radiated confidence. To her, this was the conclusion of a long campaign. The obstacle was finally being removed. The fees would stop. The arguments would end. The property could be reshaped into whatever vision she had imagined. As the hours passed, more of the structure disappeared. I felt anger, frustration, grief. But beneath all of it was something else. Calm. Because while Deborah believed she was closing a chapter, she had no idea another chapter had already begun months earlier. The application package was no longer sitting in my office. The historical records were no longer hidden in archive boxes. Copies existed with preservation experts, historical organizations, and review officials. The story of the mill had already left the valley. As sunset approached, only portions of the stone foundation remained visible beside the creek. Deborah looked satisfied. The contractors packed equipment. Neighbors slowly returned home. Standing among the remains, I heard the water continuing to flow exactly as it had for 2 centuries. And for the first time all day, I found myself wondering what Deborah's expression would look like when the letter arrived. 3 weeks after the demolition, the letter arrived. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a plain government envelope that looked far less important than it actually was. I remember standing in my kitchen with sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee lingering in the air as I opened it. At first, I simply stared at the heading. Then I read it again and again. The Federal Preservation Review Office had completed an initial assessment of the application package. Based on the documentation submitted, the mill qualified for formal heritage consideration due to its historical significance, age, documented role in regional development, and preservation value. For a long moment, I stood completely still. The structure itself was gone, but the record of what it had been was now officially recognized. More importantly, the review office requested additional information regarding the recent destruction of the site. That single sentence changed everything. Within days, preservation specialists began contacting me. Historians requested copies of photographs. Researchers asked for access to survey records and archive documents. What had once been a local dispute was suddenly attracting attention far beyond the neighborhood. The story of the mill was no longer confined to HOA meetings and community newsletters. It was entering official historical channels. The most remarkable part was how quickly the conversation shifted. For months, Deborah controlled the narrative. She described the mill as outdated. She described it as unnecessary. She described it as a burden. Now people were asking a different question. If the structure possessed documented historical significance, why had it been removed before the review process concluded? That question spread rapidly. Local historical societies began publishing articles about the mill. Community groups shared photographs online. Residents who had never attended HOA meetings suddenly wanted answers. I spent much of that month providing copies of records I had spent years collecting. Old maps, family journals, engineering reports, newspaper clippings. The deeper investigators looked, the more important the mill appeared. One historian called it one of the most thoroughly documented early industrial structures in the county. Another described it as a rare surviving example of frontier-era milling architecture. Hearing those descriptions felt bittersweet. The recognition arrived after the loss. Yet it was recognition nonetheless. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the neighborhood changed dramatically. Neighbors who once viewed the dispute as a simple disagreement began realizing they had witnessed the destruction of something much larger. Conversations at grocery stores, community events, and local gatherings increasingly centered on the same topic. How had this happened? One evening, I attended a public presentation hosted by a regional historical organization. Large photographs of the mill filled projection screens while historians discussed its significance. Looking around the room, I noticed several familiar faces from the neighborhood. Some appeared shocked by the information being presented. Others looked frustrated. Near the back sat Deborah, quiet, listening. For the first time since this entire conflict began, she was not the person controlling the discussion. Facts were. And facts have a way of traveling farther than opinions ever can. As the presentation ended and people slowly filed toward the exits, I found myself thinking back to the day the demolition equipment arrived beside the creek. Deborah believed removing the mill would erase the problem. Instead, it had done the exact opposite. The destruction had transformed a forgotten local landmark into a documented piece of American history. And the people now reviewing the story were only beginning to ask questions. The investigation did not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic announcements. It arrived through questions. Careful, methodical questions that became increasingly difficult for the HOA to answer. By early spring, multiple organizations had begun reviewing the timelines surrounding the mill's destruction. Preservation experts wanted copies of meeting minutes. Historical groups requested correspondence. Local officials asked for documentation regarding enforcement actions and decision-making processes. What started as a heritage review gradually expanded into something much larger. One afternoon, I sat in my office surrounded by stacks of records while sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the creek. The water still flowed past the empty stone foundation where the mill once stood. On my desk sat several binders containing every letter, notice, and communication I had received during the conflict. Looking through them now felt completely different. At the time, they seemed like routine disputes. In hindsight, they formed a remarkably detailed timeline. Every complaint, every fee proposal, every enforcement effort, everything was documented. The most revealing discoveries emerged from public records requests and archived HOA communications. Residents who had grown concerned about the situation began asking their own questions. Why had alternative preservation options never been discussed? Why had historical assessments been ignored? Why had removal become the preferred solution so quickly? As records surfaced, a pattern began emerging. The conversation surrounding the mill had rarely focused on factual historical evaluation. Instead, it focused on convenience, appearance, and future development plans. That distinction mattered. At several community meetings, residents openly challenged board leadership for the first time. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt completely different from the meetings I remembered months earlier. Gone were the confident presentations and one-sided discussions. In their place were difficult questions from homeowners demanding transparency. I attended one particularly memorable meeting on a rainy Thursday evening. The sound of water tapping against the windows accompanied nearly every discussion. Residents filled every available seat. Some stood along the walls. The room felt tense but controlled. One homeowner asked why no independent historical review had been conducted before major decisions were made. Another questioned why so many resources had been devoted to targeting a structure that predated the neighborhood itself. The answers were vague. The questions were not. Deborah still occupied the front of the room, but her position had changed dramatically. Months earlier, she directed the conversation. Now she responded to it. That difference became increasingly obvious as the evening progressed. Outside the HOA, the historical significance of the mill continued gaining recognition. Articles appeared in local publications. Regional preservation organizations referenced the site in educational materials. Several historians published summaries of its documented contributions to early county development. Ironically, more people learned about the mill after it was gone than during the decades it stood beside the creek. One morning, while walking along the foundation stones that remained, I noticed a family standing nearby reading an informational display installed by a local historical group. Parents explained the site's history to their children while pointing toward the creek. Watching them, I experienced a mixture of pride and sadness. The structure itself had been lost. Its story had not. Back inside the community, pressure continued mounting. Residents wanted accountability. Preservation advocates wanted answers. Officials wanted documentation. The questions kept coming. And with every new record reviewed, every archived email examined, and every meeting minute analyzed, the same reality became harder to avoid. The destruction of the mill was not ending the story. It was becoming the evidence. Summer returned to the valley almost a year after the mill disappeared. Wildflowers grew along the creek banks, and sunlight once again reflected across the water that had witnessed 2 centuries of local history. Standing near the remaining stone foundation one evening, I realized how much had changed since that morning when the demolition equipment first arrived. The investigation eventually reached its conclusion, not through dramatic confrontations or public spectacles, but through documentation. Reports were completed. Records were reviewed. Timelines were reconstructed. The findings painted a picture that many residents had already begun to suspect. Critical historical information had been overlooked. Preservation concerns had not received the attention they deserved. Decisions had been made with incomplete consideration of the structure's significance. The consequences of those conclusions rippled throughout the community. HOA leadership changed. New policies were adopted requiring independent historical reviews whenever older structures became subjects of enforcement discussions. Transparency measures were introduced. Documentation standards improved. Future boards would face far greater scrutiny before pursuing actions affecting historically significant properties. Ironically, the very organization that once treated the mill as a problem ended up creating safeguards designed to prevent similar situations from ever happening again. Deborah remained in the neighborhood, but her influence never fully recovered. People no longer viewed the story through the lens of landscaping standards or community appearance. They viewed it through the lens of history. Over time, even she seemed to understand that distinction. During one community gathering, she quietly acknowledged that the significance of the mill had been underestimated. It was not a dramatic confession. It did not need to be. By then, the facts spoke for themselves. The most unexpected development came several months later when regional preservation organizations partnered with local historians to create a permanent heritage display beside the creek. Using photographs, maps, archived records, and engineering drawings from my collection, they built an educational exhibit explaining the history of the site and the people who once depended on it. Families began visiting regularly. School groups occasionally stopped by during local history tours. Children who had never seen the original structure learned about its role in shaping the region. Every time I watched visitors reading those displays, I felt the same mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The building was gone. Its story was stronger than ever. One evening near sunset, I stood alone beside the foundation while golden light reflected across the water. The creek sounded exactly as it had when my grandfather first brought me there decades earlier. I thought about the old photographs, the journals, the survey maps, the countless hours spent in archives searching for forgotten pieces of history. At the time, I believed I was preserving a building. What I was really preserving was memory. The greatest irony of the entire story was impossible to ignore. Deborah believed removing the mill would make people forget it. Instead, its destruction ensured that more people learned about it than at any point during the previous 100 years. The structure survived 2 centuries. The records will survive much longer. As the sun disappeared behind the hills and shadows stretched across the foundation stones, I ran my hand across the remaining masonry and smiled. They saw an old mill standing in the way of their plans. I saw 200 years of American history. In the end, the building was lost. The truth was not. And sometimes that is the kind of justice that lasts the longest.